What do you think, Seb? You ready?
Always.
Let's go. Hello, everybody. It's Q&A Live, Winter Edition. Have you heard the
And
music?
still no
It's great
music on that
music.
slide.
Yeah, I love that music too. It's such a shame. Let me put my thing on. So that should be my camera. Can everybody see me? Can you? I'm not going to check because then you get infinite regression on the screen. Hi, folks. Jeff Besson here. I'm joined by Seb Monnier. We've dug
Hello.
ourselves out of a very cold winter to bring you a hot list of agenda items for discussion at today's Q&A Live. As always, you're going to get lots of demos and the opportunity to ask lots of questions. Good morning, Seb.
Good morning, Jeff. From a very cold, no, I'm kidding. It's 80 degrees this afternoon.
He's digging himself out from happiness, basking
Yeah.
in all the heat. So let's talk about today's agenda. You're going to hear from Seb for the next few items. I'm going to wrap up the day with the final agenda item. We're going to begin by looking at how one can use an experience URL to pass parameters into a web deployed experience. It's a pretty cool use of web deployed experiences. Take the URL, add stuff to the URL, and that stuff is put into the experience. You can use it to change how the experience acts or reacts, and it's really useful. Seb is going to discuss that with you. Then we'll move on to the notion of using one experience to remotely control another experience. Conceptually, you've been able to do this forever, but we always have lots of new customers, and we've learned, I think, from the past how to optimize this process and do it more efficiently, and we'll teach you how to do that, control one experience from another. We'll then kind of riff on that topic and move on to sending messages between two experiences, passing information back and forth. And you're going to participate in it. Maybe both of these, Seb, I'm not sure, but certainly passing messages. There will be audience participation, so have your mobile phones ready. And then we will wrap up today. I will walk you through some design guidance for web deployed experiences. We introduced the ability to deploy experiences to the web not too long ago. And it is sort of a different paradigm, partly because of how Intuiface works and partly how the web works. And thus, some of the considerations you might have had for building an experience to run in Windows will be a little different when you're deploying to the web. And we're going to give you some advice, some guidance for how to build a really good experience for the web. That is today's agenda. What we'll do is, for each item, either Seb or I will handle that item. And at the end, I'm going to ask some questions, and we're going to ask you to ask some questions. In the upper right-hand corner, I think that's where it is, there's a button that says questions. That's where you can enter them. We will be watching them, and I will address those questions with Seb after every agenda item. If you don't ask questions, we could have pre-recorded this thing, right? So let's get some audience participation. We'd love to hear from you, get your insight, get your opinions, and get your questions. When we're done at the end, we'll just open it up and you can ask anything. It could even be about our personal lives within reason. So that being said, Seb, if you're ready, you can take over if you want to add anything.
I guess I can. I don't have to ask you anymore.
No.
All right, screen one. And let's go. So we call this the winter edition. We should have called it the web edition. You'll see most of the topics are actually going to be related to the player next gen, which is now our player 7.5, and the ability to publish an experience on the web and the various scenarios that it can open when it comes to using interface in conjunction with a player running in venue. So let's go to the first part, which is a new interface asset, which is available in Composer, which is called the URL parser. So how to get some parameters into your web experience. And let me show a couple of examples here. Don't grab your phones yet to scan the codes. We're going to get to that. So when you publish an experience like our interface overview, which is available in the marketplace, by default, you create a slug. So this part here, which is after the slash, interface-overview. This link will lead to the experience itself. Now, in addition to the link, you can add some parameters into the URL itself. So like any web query, you can add a question mark and then a name equals value. That will be the name of the parameter and the value of the parameter. If you put an ampersand, you can add as many parameters as you want. Why would you do that? Well, the link itself will lead to the same experience. So whether I have one parameter or 10 parameters, it will still launch this slash interface dash overview experience. But these parameters will be available inside the experience to be used for various purposes. The first example here, adding this location equals IAC 2024, when someone is going to walk on our booth at IAC at the end in what, a couple of weeks from now, and they will scan the code, we will know that they scanned the code during IAC, and we can use that in our analytics, in our tracking. We have customers using this, for example, in with a concierge app in a hotel, so they can know if the link was scanned in the hotel in city A or in city B, and then in the web experience, you can display different content. If you're in London or Paris, you don't want the same content on the web experience. So how do you get these parameters? Well, now you can grab your phones if you want, and I'm going to do it at the same time here. I'm going to scan that code and go to the web browser. This is going to open this web.interface.com/Q&A January 24, our remote control for the day. And we're going to use this experience quite a bit. It seems for now that I'm the only one who did scan the code. 2, 3, all right, keep coming. 6, 8, perfect, thank you. So you can see that I have this target equals Seb laptop as a parameter. And if you look, I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to copy this URL, and that's a good way to test your work. Is just open a browser on your Windows laptop, so you don't have to go back and forth with mobile phones. And you can see my screen. So I'm getting this target equals Seb laptop from the interface asset itself. I can ask the interface asset to search for a particular parameter. So I'm searching for target. The result is Seb laptop. That's the result of my parameter. Now, if I have something like, say, an HCMS base, like I have here, I can use this value to filter, and this is the credential key, which is hidden at the end, that this experience will use later on to communicate with my actual player, my Seb laptop. So now the 21 persons connected will have the ability to send commands to my laptop, thanks to this particular parameter and the LSCMS space, which is behind the scenes. So, and I won't go too much into the details, but in a nutshell, among the interface assets, you have this new URL parser and the web deployments. That's the new interface asset. Once you add it to your experience, it will have this parameters property available. And then what you can do is on a timer, for example, in your scene, you can do a search parameter. So I'm searching for target. I'm getting an answer. The answer is a parameter is found. If we found a parameter for the target parameter, then I can set the value and then reuse that value afterwards, like filtering my headless CMS base. That's the URL parser in a nutshell. As usual, we do have an Help Center article explaining how this thing works. Jeff, usually I know we do questions after each point, but I believe we want to move to the next one in here. So we keep looking at some real case examples of how to use this parameter. That's okay for you?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so you're all connected to my experience, but right now from the scene that you see, you cannot do much. If I go back to the web experience, I have a hidden way myself to go to this panel where now I can have a remote control. So I can send some commands from this web app in here to my Windows machine, my Windows player, because I have the proper credential key, I have the right, I was authorized to do that through the QR code which I had. This works both ways, meaning if you make sure your phone is open and you're still on the page, if I click on this button, now this is going to become a mess because all of you, yeah, that was going to happen. All of you can now decide which video is displayed on my screen. So obviously this is not a real case scenario. You would never want to do that, right? But you all get the idea, and at least some of you have been testing this, which is good. Thank you. We're good. So how does that work? Again, if we go into our experience here, we are receiving web triggers. And from the remote control, when I have my video base coming from an headless CMS base and I click on the button, I am sending a message using the API key I retrieved from my base. Thanks to my QR code, I know which API key I need to use, what is my target. And I'm sending the ID of a video as a parameter, play that video. On the main experience, I'm receiving that trigger, that web trigger, filtering my base and playing that video. On the other hand, for my main experience, when I click that give access to audience, I am sending also a message, a web trigger message to a particular experience running on my account. And that's the tricky part. When you clicked on the QR code, when you scanned the QR code, you loaded the URL, this URL, which is hosted by my account. So you're using my views licensing. Thanks to that, using my credential key, I can send commands to all of these experiences running in the web. So what's the real life use case? Executive Briefing Center, you have a tour guide, that's me. You have an audience, that's you. And I want you to participate to a quiz, to a live quiz, to a poll. I want you to engage with the screens you are seeing during that tour. So you're not just listening to a tour guide talking, you're actively participating. That's actually what we're going to do in the next one. And after we will make a pause and go through all the questions. So let's go to this way of using the two-way web triggers. And I'm going to start the poll. So on your phones, you should now see this question. What OS are you currently or will you use when using Interface Player the most? Windows, Android, iOS, Brightside. Okay, I already received a bunch of answers, so I'm going to answer myself. Now, this is a single question, but the key is that when I hit the start poll, I can control all what the mobile phones are seeing. I can drive you through the next question. So the tour guide can pace the rhythm for the visit and for what's happening on all the devices which don't have Interface Player installed. And that's the beauty of hosting an experience on the web and opening it just through one QR code. Now, this code had only one parameter, the target Seb laptop. In the real life of this particular customer I have in mind, which is actively using this in their executive briefing centers, they are using a unique session ID to make sure that you cannot reopen the same link and try to send some questions to a different group visiting the facility. They have a location because they have several briefing centers in the world. So we know that the phone is sending the message, the answer, to the proper player running in the location they are actually at. So this URL parser, which sounds like something fairly simple, get a parameter from a URL, can open very powerful scenarios. All right, so we did get about 11 answers. Now what's going on is when you're sending the answers, I am receiving them in my main experience and I am logging some analytics. You know, it takes about 1 or 2 minutes, which is why I keep talking, while I see this number going up, so that at some point I will end the poll and just show the results using our charts from the interface analytics dashboard. So I already see a first question coming. Will there be a tutorial on your website covering this topic? It's a good question. There will be definitely the recording from this session, and it was difficult to gauge how deep I should go today in this webinar. And to be honest, I covered the 3 topics in 10 minutes, so I will probably go deeper in here. But the 2 main components are the URL parser to get the parameters you will need at some point to manage this communication between the main experience, the master, and the web experience, the remotes. So the URL parser and then web triggers. I should say maybe 3, because web triggers, when we look into our composer here, we do have the web triggers that will receive the web triggers. So in this particular experience, that's the remote. I have 2 triggers. When I receive a go to scene, I go to scene using the parameter 1 of the web trigger. That's how I am making your phones navigate to a different scene. The second one I have, I believe, is the endpoint. When I'm going to hit this endpoint, it will ask your phones to close the tab to end the experience. That's receiving the web triggers. The other side is sending messages. And this is actually done with the API Explorer. If you remember, for the web triggers, we do have our web trigger API, and that's the send message I'm using. So all I did here in my composer was to use this send message with my API key, put a go to scene. I want to go to the scene poll, for example, and execute. And that's the URL I would use in API Explorer to create my send message. Once I have done that, anytime I need to send a message from the remote to the main experience, or from the main experience to the remotes, I am just calling this send message action with my credential key and use whatever message I want and whatever parameters I want. So that's the gist of the architecture besides these use cases. So let me just go back here, received. I'm going to end the poll. And I would probably need to refresh these pages. Let me just go back and forth. All right, that looks much better. So these are the answers we received from the poll on the right side. So a lot of people answered Windows. Kind of makes sense. We still have about 70-something% of our users running on Windows players. But I also know that most of you already have an iPhone, because when you open that experience, when you scan that code, I do log an event and I do send some, hey, this experience was opened with this particular target, Seb laptop, and I have my system info, which gives me some minimal information about the device being used. It's Windows, Android, iOS. I could probably know the browser maybe, but that's it. So it's very anonymous, still can give some interesting data. So Ahmed, I hope that answers your question about the tutorial. Can I do one tutorial for this? Might be difficult because there are so many use cases. But the gist of it is really web triggers, send message through the API Explorer and our web trigger API, and then the URL parser to know to whom I need to send that message. We do have a second question from Paolo, which is, does this mean we don't have to use the Webflow code for the remote control, Webflow or WordPress or any HTML custom code that we had before? And yes, so this part here, which is running on your phone at the moment, is an interface experience built in Composer. There was 0 code written to build that web page. We are using some interface assets, which are all available in Composer, like the URL parser, the web triggers, the system info to know if you have an iOS or an Android phone. The two which you might see here on my screen, which are not available, are this block refresh page, which we will release at some point. It's to prevent you from closing the tab without wanting to do it. Like if you hit the refresh, if you swipe down to refresh, you might lose the connection to the remote control. And the close tab is the one I use when I hit the end pole to try to force closing that tab. I had my phone shut down, so I don't know if it actually worked. When I did this, so now I have a pop-up on the phone asking me if I actually want to leave that website. Again, this is some custom interface set written in TypeScript. It will be published at some point. It's probably 10 lines of code, so it should be pretty easy to write if you want to write it yourself. But that's all we are using here. And that send message built with the API Explorer. So Jeff, I know I went actually way faster than what I thought on these different use cases because they are all tied together, and it's using the URL parser to get these parameters, using a remote control to enable somebody to control what's going on a big screen, for example. Could be a passive screen, non-touch. This could be running here if you had your remote with the videos. That could be a sales associate tablet or phone who wants to change the videos playing on a bigger screen to help him in his discussion with a potential customer. That could be in a museum where you have a small kiosk controlling a bigger video projector, showing some high-res content on a bigger screen. You have so many different scenarios here. But it's more on the one-way side, like the remote control sends commands to the bigger screen, let's say. And then you have the two-way web triggers where the tour guide can control what step you should see on the mobile phone and the audience can send back information. We just did the click a button to send an answer. It could be open text. It could be dictate something with your voice like we did with the OpenAI sample in the marketplace. Lots and lots of use cases and potential scenarios here. I'm going to stop talking here. Jeff, I know you had some questions, so.
I have some questions. I represent the For Dummies part of the audience, and I have a few questions. Well, I want to point something out first because you mentioned it, but I guess indirectly, and people need to be aware. What's really impressive about this, there's many impressive things, but that the web deployed experiences are actively waiting for messages. They're actively polling. They're listening for something. They're not a dead web page. So they're always waiting to see the way you built it, right? The way you built it with web triggers, they're always listening for a possible message. It's pretty cool, actually. And it works both ways.
Yes. So as far as I know, because again, remember, this hosting experiences on the web is also pretty new for us. This is true. They are waiting. I want to say if they are active, like for example, when I had the when I did the end poll and my phone was turned off, I mean, it went into sleep mode. I don't think I received the web trigger because when I turn it on again, the web page was not asking me, hey, do you want to quit that page, leave that page? So it had to be on. It had to be looking at the page. If I had switched to another tab in my browser, honestly, I don't know if I would have received that web trigger. So these are good questions. I don't have the answer. But again, to put this into the perspective of what's the use case, if you have an audience in front of you trying to answer a quiz, they should be looking at it. They should have it in the hand, and the tour guide should not be talking as much as I am. And so the flow should be should be quicker.
Let me ask a. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was
I'm
going to
looking
say
at my
that does
computer.
raise a question for myself. Can I prevent the phone from going into sleep mode with a custom interface set? Maybe. I'll have to look into that.
You mentioned for the remote control that the experiences are in the same Intuiface account. That's a rule. They need to be in the same. Can you send web triggers between experiences that are not? I don't know why you would do that, but can you send experience triggers between experiences not in the same Intuiface?
So, good question. And actually, that joins the latest question we just got in the chat. Can you individually address each experience running on each phone? So the answer to that is no. And let me try to explain here with our API. So this is the WebTrigger API. The way it works in the demos we just went through, from the remote to my laptop, we send a message with a parameter using a credential key. The credential key needs to belong to the same account that owns the license used on my laptop. If I rephrase that, the player on my laptop belongs to Seb. If you want to send a message to Seb's player, you need Seb's credential key. If Jeff uses his credential key, he cannot send a message to my player. So the remote control needs to use Seb's credential key to send a message to Seb's laptop player. That's the web to in-venue direction. When you do that, because I do have a player installed on my device, I can target it by my player device name, by my player ID, my player tag, one of these three optional parameters. Again, putting this into the scenario of the briefing center from this company that has several centers in the world, we are using player IDs because if somebody is in Berlin scanning a code, we don't want them to send their pole answers to Tokyo. So when you have an installed player, it is unique. It has a unique ID. It has a device name. It can have some tags. You can target it specifically. On the other way around, when you have an experience published on the web and you open it in a browser, whether it's through scanning a QR code or opening a link in an email, doesn't matter. You are opening a URL in a web browser. You do not have a player installed. You do not have a unique license. You are using views from a views license model for our experiences hosted on the web. There's no player ID, there's no player tag, there's no player device name. It's kind of anonymous. But it does have an experience name. So what I'm doing here from my main experience, when I hit this start poll, I am kind of broadcasting the message to all my QA Jan 24 remote control experiences that are running somewhere on the network, somewhere on the internet. And the reason I can send a message from here to these experiences is because I use a credential key that belongs to the same account that is hosting this web experience. So if we look into my experiences here, I'm logged in as my own account. If I search for remote, that's my remote control, the one you've been running on your phones. Deploy as web page. That's my views licensing, which we are using here. So this link, QA Jan 24 remote, is attached to my account. It's like using a license from my account. Because of that, if I want to send a message to this experience running on dozens of phones, I need to use one of my credential keys. So do they have to be the same? No. Jeff could be hosting this experience on his account. I would have to use his credential key to send message to the remotes. That's how it
The
works.
key.
Now, to one quick question that some of you might see coming is, okay, if I'm broadcasting to all the remote experiences, how is the tour guide in Berlin not sending a message to a visitor in Tokyo? Technically, he is. He is sending that message to all the remote controls that are running this particular experience. And that's where, for this particular experience center, we use additional parameters with the URL parser. And so we have a notion of session ID, unique session ID, which we generate on the fly and add as a parameter to the QR code. So what we do on the remote control side, when we receive a message, let's say go to scene, we also check that our parameter 3, let's say, is equal to the session ID which I got from my QR code, from my URL parser. So I am receiving all the messages, but I'm filtering them to only take the ones that I should have, that I should be concerned with. That's how we deal with this 1 to N scenario, one master to N audience, without having a player, without having unique IDs for the audience phones running in the web. Now,
Thank you.
Paolo, to answer your question, if each phone was scanning an individual QR code, so you would reset the QR code each time it's been scanned, and each phone had a unique session ID, then you could target each phone individually. You just wouldn't know which is who, or which is whom, or who is who. Not sure how to say that.
I think it's which is whom. We've had a few more questions come in. I had a couple for you, but let's get to the audience first. We have a couple more minutes, I think, to sit on this. Using your phone to control a wall. So that was the question. Scan a code on my phone, I'm controlling that wall. It's the same. Sure. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing with this video wall. Actually, this sample is a subset of a sample experience we will release, hopefully in a few weeks, to control a 2x2 video wall. In our videos, we run it on BrightSign, on the 4055 on BrightSign, the new device with 4 video outputs. And so we have the main screen divided as a quadrant, so 4 quadrants. And then from the remote control, you can decide if you want one video full screen or one video in each quadrant. And I just made a simpler version here for the webinar today, but it uses the same base, same content. The scenario is that we are running a BrightSign we are using a BrightSign to run a passive screen, like huge video wall. And then we use either a tablet or a small all-in-one Bluefin, so embedded BrightSign device as the remote to control what's running in the room, in conference room or showroom or things like that. But that's exactly the same architecture, yes.
I'm trying to decide if we should get to the last agenda item first. You know what? In light of the time, let's go to the next agenda item. There are a couple other questions in the queue. We'll get back to those, you know? So let me get myself set up here. Maybe we can avoid infinite regression. Let's see. Maybe if I just share the app, huh? Hopefully we see PowerPoint and the agenda. So what we're going to discuss now, you get to hear my voice a little bit more. Some design guidance when building experiences for the web. As I mentioned when we started off today's session, there are some considerations you need to make because you're deploying to the web. It is not the same conceptually and technically when deploying to the web versus deploying what we call in-venue, running in player on a device. You install player and then you run it on Windows, on BrightSign, when you deploy to the web, it is different. And so there are some considerations you should make. So let's walk through some of those. There is an article in the Help Center, which I can pull up later, that dives into this quite deeply. So the first is about aspect ratio, and this is particularly relevant to mobile devices. Because if I'm on a browser on my Windows PC, well, the browser has essentially the same aspect ratio as my PC display, and so it's a traditional 16:9 or what have you. But for smartphones, holy crap, it is all over the place. And you need to think about that, right? Because if you build an experience that looks great on your Windows PC and then try to deploy it to the web, it is not going to look great on the phone. It will not look good on the phone. The rule that hasn't changed is we always maintain aspect ratio. Whatever the aspect ratio is in Composer when you publish, that will be retained. It might be resized to fit the container, but it will always maintain the same aspect ratio. Aspect ratio, hopefully most of you know, it's sort of the ratio between the width and the height, that ratio. Okay. A lot of your screens are 1920 by 1080. That's a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is also called full HD, to make it more complicated. And so a typical Windows PC display, a typical digital signage display, is often some variation of 16:9, maybe 16:10, like a 1920 by 1080. That's typical. But again, mobile phones typically are not 16 by 9. They're not. In fact, they can have, so it's odd for me, maybe it's not odd for you. 19.5 by 9 is the most common aspect ratio for iPhones. There's a reason for it, I'm sure. I don't know what it is. So an example dimension is 422 pixels wide by 915 pixels tall. That's the typical aspect ratio for an iPhone. For other operating systems, it could be 16:9 or 29, and you can see some of the dimensions there. So it is not technically possible. You cannot publish a single experience and it fills every possible display. We don't do responsive design. We will not change an aspect ratio. It is what it is. Meaning, if you know that your web deployed experience will be running on the web, you need to pick the most common, the most likely aspect ratio and live with it. And what will happen is you'll get black bars on the axis that doesn't completely fill the screen. That's what will happen. Okay. The aspect ratio is different, so it doesn't perfectly fit the display. So the part of where the experience ends, you get these black bars. So what you need to do is say, well, what is the most common deployment option, the most universal aspect ratio, and run with it. Maybe one day we'll have some sort of, depending on the aspect ratio, run a different experience, but that does not exist. It doesn't. So no responsive design. We never did, still don't. You need to find the most common aspect ratio. Whether you deploy to the web for mobile use or as a progressive web app, which is the ability to run web deployed experiences as if they're an app on a device, they don't ever actually go full screen anyway. You can't force hide the nav bar. For example, Seb, you know this better than me. It's not even just the nav bar, or is it mainly the nav bar? That's the problem.
I'm sorry, I was reading a question at the same time. Say it again.
That's okay. So we're talking about the parts of a web deployed experience we can't hide yet, like the nav bar, right?
Yes.
So
are
there other things we can't hide too? Or is that the main one? Go ahead.
So that's a tricky one, and actually that's something I wanted to add to this particular slide. The experience you all open on your phones with the QR code I showed you on the screen was using a 422 per 915 resolution, so the regular iPhone ratio, and still you probably had some black bars on the left and right side. Why? Because in your browser, Safari, Chrome, whatever you use, you do have this nav bar, this title bar, these buttons, which are not taken into account into this ratio. And that's where I'm saying ourselves, we are still learning. What is a good ratio for a web app which is run into a web browser, inside a web browser, which is not your screen ratio, but it's the web view ratio minus the navbar.
That's exciting, but yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then do you have an iPhone or an iPhone Plus or Max? Do you have a Samsung S20 something or an Ultra, which is longer? It's a nightmare. So I know in the pipe we are planning to offer some customization for these black bars to make them fit better into your design. But because interface has still this notion of resolution-based experiences versus responsive design for the web, that's what we have to deal with so far.
Yep.
Is it more than good enough in most cases? Yes, it can be.
But you need to account for it. You need to plan for it and
Yes.
consider it
If you
as you
were,
design.
yeah, if you were planning to deliver this experience as a PWA, so using our player licensing, not the views licensing, so that people can actually install
Which
this
we'll talk
web
about in
app
a moment.
as an app, that would take the navbar out. So it really depends on the use case, the scenario, the licenses you want to use, and who is the end user. If it's a visitor coming to a briefing center for an hour, you don't want them to install an app. So you need to keep that navbar into account in most cases.
Thank you. And it brings me to another topic, which is the native asset controls. For example, the video asset has a play button, or which becomes a pause button. The resolution you pick for your experience, when it is scaled for the resolution of the device, will play with that size of those native controls, and in a way that is not easy to predict. It's predictable, but it's going to hurt your brain, and it might not be worth it. Basically, the higher the resolution of the experience, if it is squeezed to a smaller resolution, things get very small. And if it's built in experience in Composer in a very big, I should say very small resolution display, then if it's sized up, it gets very big. The point is, test it out and maybe consider using your own controls. Don't rely on the asset control itself. Make your own control. You have much more ability to determine its size and how it looks. So this is more of a test kind of thing. Make sure you like how it looks and play with it if you don't. Moving on to licensing. Seb has addressed this a couple of times. I'm not sure everybody even knows the distinction, so let's talk about the distinction for a moment. When you deploy to the web, you have a licensing choice. You can choose from player licensing or views licensing. And this table illustrates the difference. At a high level, the difference is this. I'm going to oversimplify a bit, but at a high level, this is a good way to think about it. Player licensing proactively downloads everything up front. Views licensing loads on demand when something is needed. And you can see in this table, in-venue licensing, traditional use of player, forget web deployment. I just install player in Windows, I'm running an experience. That's player licensing, and it really is technically downloading everything, right? The whole experience is on the local device. Everything is on the local device when you deploy in-venue. Well, if I deploy to the web, whether it's run in a browser or installed as a PWA, if it's player licensed, then when it is accessed, when it is opened, everything is downloaded, okay? Proactively. With views licensing, no. If the video is on scene 3, I'm not loading the video until I'm on scene 3. Views licensing will delay that request until necessary. Why these distinctions? Well, there's a couple reasons. Player licensing lets you go offline, right? That's good. So maybe you need to be offline. Even though it's web deployed, because it's player licensed, you can go offline. That's pretty good. With views licensing, well, it'll run much faster because it's not waiting for all this stuff to download. It's going to only load what it has to. So it will appear faster in the browser. So there's a trade-off. But there are very legitimate scenarios on both sides, which is why we offer both options. The player licensing option, that's the identical license to the player you've been using on Windows and Brightside. It's the same player. Absolutely no difference at all. But that does mean If I'm using player licensing and 5 people put the URL in their browser, that's 5 player licenses. So you could eat up your player license supply pretty quickly, depending on how many people you give that URL to. So be aware of that. Views licensing is measured in terms of views, and you buy packages of views, and depending on your audience size, who do we have now, 20 or 30 people? Well, if you have a package of 3,000 views, you got a lot of views to come. So there's licensing implications and there's user experience implications. There's a choice to be made, right? And so keep these in mind when you're making license decisions. Views licensing will load faster. The user experience will be better because they're seeing things more quickly and may be able to interact more quickly. On the other hand, player licensing makes for a much more resilient application that can even go offline if you lose a network connection. Maybe it's not even the point to be offline, but it is resilient if it does. Okay. Moving on from that, some image optimization things to think about. So images. And actually, this advice, certainly the size advice, really wouldn't be any different for in-venue deployment, to be honest, which is there's the media and then there's the container for the media. The image asset is technically different from the actual image. The image asset is the container, and the container has an image inside it. If that image will never change size, if it is a static image, it is meant to decorate your experience, nobody's ever meant to manipulate it, then we would recommend make sure that image is no bigger than the container in which it will live. If it's bigger than the container, then you're forcing the experience to load an image unnecessarily large, which puts a little extra burden on how long it takes to download. And remember, we're on the web where people are less patient. So ideally, you right size the image. The image is no bigger than its container if it will never be manipulated. On the other hand, if it will be manipulated, then we recommend putting it in at the maximum size. So it's already there. Yes, it takes longer to download, but you want people to manipulate that image. They might make it that size. You already want it to be on that device. You don't want it to have to do any processing, for example. And as with in-venue deployments, there is still a max size. Why you would have an image that big in the web deployed experience is shame on you. But in terms of the format, we do support WebP. End of story, you should use WebP. It is web optimized. It is a very compressed format for images. It's really just use WebP. You could use PNG, you could use bitmap, you could use GIF. We're saying don't. It's going to be more work. There are products like Squoosh that will automatically compress a lot of your images, convert them into the WebP format. So it's an extra step, but your users will be thankful because everything will download fast. On the video optimization front, there are multiple types of video containers. There are multiple types of codecs. Just use an MP4 container, an H.264 codec, which is fairly standard. I don't know that that's particularly unusual, but you might have videos that are different. And we're saying, you know what? For the web, this is a fairly optimized package. I think I hit something by accident. So use that. And just like there's a Squoosh for images, there's stuff like FFmpeg for videos, where if you have different container and or codec, you can repackage. So we would recommend that. So I didn't know this, but this is good to know. Don't use animated GIFs. They just don't play nice with browsers. They can be very heavy and very awkward and very slow. We'll let you do it. We're saying you shouldn't. If you can stream using YouTube, you may not have even thought of this, but it is technically an option. And of course, if it's streaming, then it's not being loaded. And so again, you're reducing the burden on the experience to be loaded into the browser, waiting for things to load. If it's streaming, you don't have to wait for that video. If it's a 1 gigabyte video, well, you now got to wait until the 1 gigabyte of video is downloaded, not if it's on YouTube. So if you can stream it, great. If not, okay. We recommend MP4 H.264. Fonts. This is probably something you may not have considered, but fonts can be heavy too. Composer defaults to the Sego UI font, and apparently it's 8 megabytes in size, which doesn't sound huge, but when you're downloading a web page, every kilobyte counts, let alone megabytes. That's a big font. And so if you're just living with the default font in Composer, your web pages have to download that font. There are lightweight fonts. We work with Google Fonts perfectly well, and apparently they're nicely optimized. So consider using one of those to make your experience more lightweight.
Jeff,
Um,
on that topic,
yeah,
on the font, I just wanted to add that we are going to improve the Help Center article with these design guidances, especially regarding the fonts and how to kind of clean up your experience. Um, I've been a culprit myself of increasing the size of our web experiences because I use a lot of buttons outside of the scene, like my controllers, to gather triggers and actions, as I've shown before in some other webinars. And a button by default has a text that says button. Even if you rename it into animation starter, this text has a font. And by default, it is Sego UI because Microsoft Composer, things like that. So while cleaning your experience, there are ways to know exactly which fonts are being loaded. You can see that in your Windows Explorer in the experience folder. And you still have some Sego while you think you shouldn't have any because you are not using Sego in your experience. It's probably because you have a button hidden somewhere that still is using that font.
that's a
It's a
great
tricky
point. You
one.
just need one button with one letter, and it's going to download the whole file. Yep,
Technically, even
very
without a
good point.
letter, but
You know, well, okay, I would not have predicted that, but okay.
no,
Um,
we need to optimize that and to make this easier for our users to automate that a little bit more. But for now, this cleanup has to be made manually by the composer user.
Thank you for that. Good. The experience itself, this is something I also learned as we rolled out Player Next Gen. Um, Big picture recommendation, the overall experience should be below a gigabyte in size. And the reason we're making this recommendation is that browsers impose disk usage limits on websites. I didn't know that. Very interesting to know. So, for example, each tab in the Chrome browser can individually only use up to 60% of on-device storage. I don't know where they came up with that number, but that's the rule. And so, is 1 gigabyte a rule? No, it's a suggestion because it kind of depends on how much disk storage is left on each person's device, right? But we recommend this as a just in case. So, something to keep in mind. Uh, and there are some differences here. A progressive web app is, I think, there's a difference in Safari. There are some nuances I didn't think was worth mentioning, but just keep this kind of generic guidance in mind.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
for a
I think that's
pure web, just to again to comment on this one, this 1 gigabyte is like kind of a high limit to me. Um, and that again, there's this difference. Is it a PWA that needs to be installed? Might be okay. Is it a web experience that it kind of an uh, quick experience for a user, like passing through a museum or a briefing center or something temporary? 1 gigabyte is huge. And if you are in the US with these pretty expensive mobile phone plans where every single megabyte counts in your plan, you don't want to spend 1 gigabyte when you are in a museum visiting something. Uh, so I would keep that in mind and go much, much lower with what if you were building a website? What would your marketing or communication team tell you when using the size of an image, when using the size of a video? And have this mindset of website creation versus interface creation as you've done in the past for in-venue setups, where we don't really care about the size for an in-venue setup. Um, fun fact, I've seen yesterday a customer coming to us, hey, we've built this great experience that runs on BrightSign in a museum. The customer wants to put it on the web. Great. The experience is 11 gigabytes. It has 250 videos. It has 16 megapixel images, thousands of them. Would you build a website with that content? That's it.
I mean, yeah. I mean, some of what I mean, look, not all of our users are tech savvy. That's part of our value prop is you don't need to be tech savvy. So they just don't even. I mean, they just throw stuff in experience and expect it to work, right? So we partly have a responsibility to protect people from themselves, and the font example is a good one, right? We should be protecting people proactively.
Good.
So it's partly on us and partly to give good advice. So that's a run through of our design guidance. As I said, there's an article in the Help Center, which I'll pull up in a moment, But Seb, we can return to any of the open questions and take new ones as they roll in.
Yeah, so
I
there were a
see you've
couple of
answered a lot
questions
better.
about building a tutorial for this app. Um, I also got a note about I should have created a diagram showing the flow of communication of data and event between the two experiences, between the experiences and the headless CMS base. Um, Probably should have gone with that diagram. I will probably write an article giving an example. We do have an article already that explains how to communicate between two experiences, and which we need to uh, update with that web experiences notion. And that probably would be either a new section in this article or a side article. Not sure yet. In the meantime, if you have a project that relates to these kind of scenarios, this kind of architecture, and you have doubts on how to build it, don't be shy, don't wait, ask us. Um, Either send me an email, you probably all have my email address already, or just go on support. And if there's something posted about this webinar or communication, I will hear about it. I will be happy to help you go into the right direction.
I am going to take the URL for the page that I mentioned. So in the chat window is a link to the article with design guidance. A lot more of a deep dive. I will say consider that article, it's a work in progress, right? So we'll continue to update it as we learn more ourselves. Customers try stuff we realize is a bad idea, maybe a good idea. I don't know. Were there other open questions? I see a couple more here.
I don't know if it's a question, but I once saw an XP with over 500 scenes. I almost fell off my chair. I've seen one of those. I've seen a few. um, yeah, it's not just for the web. Any experience with 500 scenes should be simplified with some kind of data source, whether it's Excel, HTML, or something else. When are you releasing the IAs, the interface assets related to Player Next Gen, Player for the web? You may have, I did mention that the URL parser is released. You can already find it in Composer. And that's the main one which is being used here in this demo. The close tab and what's the other one I was using? Block refresh page to be discussed. We need to go through the product team, product review, code review. But if you need them, just ask me. I'd be happy to share my ugly non-reviewed code with you. We have a. So is there an article on the parser? Yes. Jeff, do you mind sharing your screen again? You want to show that?
Article on the parser. Yeah. Well, I can. You're gonna have to see the infinite regression again because I have to share my browser.
So Alex, we're gonna get back to you on this one, but yes, if you just type in URL parser in Composer search bar, you should find it. There it is. So we explain how it works, and basically you just add it to the experience. It will parse automatically the URL when you load the experience in the browser, and then you use the action. Is it search parameter or find parameter? I don't remember how we named it. You give it the name of the parameter you're looking for, and it will reply with a trigger with the value. Either parameter is found, you have the name and the value, or the parameter is not found, and then you only have the name. Should be pretty straightforward to use. Another question from Scott. That's a good one. Can the default font in interface be changed to Google Fonts, or is that a copyright issue? Ooh, I don't know how to answer this one. I can only say we will ask the team. I can say why we have Segway UI as the default font, because 12 years ago we were Microsoft partners, and when we created Composer in .NET, running on Microsoft Surface, which was not a tablet, was more like a fridge size table. Segoe UI was the font to use, and that was the Microsoft default font. That's the legacy we've been keeping in Composer.
As old as Composer itself. Look, we're at the hour. I had one question I wanted to ask, and we have enough people sticking around. Let me just get this out there. We've talked about progressive web apps a little bit, the concept, the notion. Can you do URL parsing with the PWAs? Does that mean anything? Can you pass parameters in to a PWA, or no? It's got to be pure web deploy kind of thing.
It's got to be on the web, because that's a good question, and I wondered myself. So when you go to install a PWA the first time, you basically open the URL in your browser and then you do install. On iOS, I think it's at the home screen. On Android, it's something else. I don't remember the exact terms, but you have to go through the browser first to install it. When you go through the browser first, you could have parameters and you could use them. But when you close that browser and go on the icon on your home screen to launch that PWA, you don't have any more parameters. So they become kind of useless.
It strips even if you wanted to just remember the original parameters, even that won't work. It essentially strips them off. Did you hear what I asked?
So,
okay, yeah.
No, Vincent is actually sending me answers on the chat about the Google fonts. They are open source. They can be used for commercial products. So I guess we can consider that, and we might look into it. Might be a good suggestion. Hey, Vincent, since you're here in the background, Paolo has a question for you. Will there ever be a Composer next gen? What can we say about that?
Sure. I mean, will there ever? I don't know. I mean, we want it, and we're thinking about it. So
do we have
sure
people working on it right now? Maybe, maybe not.
Maybe. But sure. I mean, look, sure, we want it. Absolutely, yes. So I think it's safe to say, yeah, at some point there'll be a Composer next gen. But, you know, that's all we can say.
Don't ask when. We won't answer that.
Look, we're at the hour. Great participation as always. Seb, great content as always. The people that came to this session are our favorite, and I can say that safely because the other people aren't here. So we love you the most. We wish you guys a great new year. Seb, thank you as always. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff, and Happy New Year to you all.
Yeah, Happy New Year. We'll send you a link to the recording. Thanks, guys. It was awesome. Take care.
Bye-bye.